Hello, 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 and welcome back to another video. This is Murder, She Told, and we are going to be continuing with my series called Black Girl Reacts. We are going to be reacting to a documentary that you can find on YouTube. I'll link it in the description below. It's called 13th. It was made, I believe, in 2016, and it is a movie detailing the prison system, the mass incarceration system in America, its origin story, and all things like that. It's going to be kind of intense, so trigger warning if this subject matter is a little bit intense for you, if it's triggering for you. But we're going to be talking about real stuff on this channel, and this is part of it. I wanted to choose this documentary. I haven't seen it in years, but I remember being greatly affected by the message of it, the way it was constructed, and I'm just so excited to be sharing it on my channel. So, without further ado, we're gonna get into this shit. All right. Okay.
So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that.
Think about it.
A little country with 5% of the world's population having 25% of the world's prisoners? One out of four human beings with their hands on bars, shackled, in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
We had a prison population.
Hypocrisies.
Today we have a prison population of 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
So you see now, suddenly they're an awakening that, perhaps we need to downsize our prison system. It's gotten too expensive. It's gotten out of hand. But the very folks who often express so much concern about the cost and the expanse of the system are often very unwilling to talk in any serious way about remedying the harm that has been done.
Okay.
They
are preaching.
Happens by accident. We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. If we're white. If we are black, we are products of the history that our ancestors most likely did not choose.
Okay.
We all are together the products of that set of choices, and we have to understand that in order to escape.
Ooh, this white man is preaching, honey. God.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. In other words, it grants freedom to all Americans. There are exceptions, including criminals.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
One of the things that people have to bear in mind is that when we think about slavery, it was an economic system, and the demise of slavery at the end of the Civil War left the Southern economy in tatters. And so this presented a big question. There are 4 million people who were formerly property, and they were formerly kind of the integral part of the economic production system in the South, and now those people are free. And so what do you do with these people?
Oh my God.
How do you rebuild your economy? The 13th Amendment loophole was immediately exploited.
After the Civil War, African Americans were arrested en masse. It was our nation's first prison boom.
you are basically a slave again. The 13th Amendment says that, hey, except for criminals, everybody else is free. Well, now if you're criminalized, that doesn't apply to you.
They were arrested for extremely minor crimes like loitering or vagrancy.
And they had to provide labor to rebuild the economy of the South after the Civil War.
What you got after that was a rapid transition to a kind of mythology of black criminality.
Okay.
So that, read the rhetoric that people use there. They would say that the Negro is out of control, that there's a threat of violence to white women. So the same sort of image we had of Uncle Remus and these genial kind of black figures was replaced by this rapacious, menacing Negro male evil that had to be banished.
I'm going to just pause it here to say this before we get into the nitty gritty. We're 4 minutes in, and this documentary is so good. I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to watch it. Honestly, everybody should watch it because all of the things they're talking about are factual. But that last part we were listening to about how the connection between the loophole in the 13th Amendment that basically says, slavery is outlawed now, but criminals are not considered American citizens, so that means that they can be exploited for their labor. Now, I have so many thoughts and ideas about criminals, how we treat our criminals, our prison system, and how it doesn't actually work for people. It's not really about rehabilitation. But suffice that to say, because of that loophole and the fact that it was instantly exploited through racial means, so they're directly connecting the loophole to the 13th Amendment and race through the fact that they started to begin to propagandize the time period with, images of, like this man said, rapacious, menacing, savage, black male images. So the overall public was already beginning to be indoctrinated about Black people, Black men specifically, and the fact that they're savage and they're just naturally criminals, which adds to the mythos of what a Black man in this country means. And we still go and do this to this day. But through that indoctrination, it became normalized and greased the wheels for hyper-criminalization of Black people. You heard them say it. Okay, minor things, loitering, getting arrested for loitering, vagrancy, things like that. Now they were sent back to the fields without any hope of being able to get out of the field situation. They are being sent back to provide the free labor that all the Southern nations lost when they lost the Civil War. So we're already seeing this process happening. We're already seeing how the media has such a great effect on people's perceptions and people's ideas. A lot of people forget or don't even know that a lot of opinions and stereotypes about and gender norms about how the world should be are all constructed for us. In the past, there was a diversity of societal existence. There are matriarchal societies. There are patriarchal societies. There are monarchies. There are all of these different ways this society could be constructed. There are societies like in Native American indigenous cultures where they praised queerness and they praised intersex people. They praised people who were, trans at the time. I don't know if that terminology was obviously there, but you know what I mean? They were called two-spirited people. So there was a time before the society that we exist in, but we are taught and indoctrinated from the time that we can hear things and see things that this is the way society is, this is the only way society can be, and this is the only possible way to have a functioning system. But as we're seeing with this mythos about black men being dangerous and criminals and all of this stuff, this is when that started. And that was post Civil War in the 1800s, like in the late 1800s. That wasn't that long ago, honestly. My great grandparents were alive in the late 1800s. That's just a couple generations up from me. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just one of those things where we have to remember sociologically that the way in which we exist and interact with each other in society today has all been constructed for us. This is a system that is constructed for us, and for why? Now that's a question you have to ask yourself and you have to unpack yourself. But the things that we deem to be natural, like the nuclear family or, Christianity being heavily influential in our culture, that didn't exist 600 years ago in this country. That didn't exist 700 years ago in this same territory. There are people who were able to construct their own societies, and they created them in different ways. So I think that's really important about how many stereotypes and things that we are conditioned to believe. By the time we're older, we don't even really have the critical thinking skills unless you go out of your way to work those out and exercise those, to understand that the way we've been taught about what a woman is supposed to be, what a man is supposed to be, what a child is supposed to be, what a black person's supposed to be, what a white person's supposed to be, has been so ingrained in our daily life that unless you go out of your way to try and deconstruct that, it's just not possible for some. A lot of things are constructed here.
Birth of a Nation was just a profoundly important cultural event.
It's the first major blockbuster film, hailed for both its artistic achievement and for its political commentary.
And when it was released, it had this rapturous response. There were lines, everywhere that it was being shown.
Birth of a Nation confirmed the story that many whites wanted to tell about the Civil War and its
Exactly.
aftermath. To erase defeat and to take out of it sort of a martyrdom. Woodrow Wilson, the sitting president, had a private screening of Birth of a Nation at the White House. He calls it history written with lightning.
And every image you see of a black person is a demeaned, animal-like image. Cannibalistic, animalistic. The image of the African-American male.
There's a famous scene where a woman throws herself off a cliff rather than be raped by a black male criminal. In the film, you see black people being a threat to white women.
All the myths of black men as rapists was ultimately stemmed by the reality that the white political elite and the business establishment needed black bodies working.
Okay.
What we overlook about Birth of a Nation was that it was also a tremendously accurate prediction of the way in which race would operate in the United States. Birth of a Nation was almost directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It had received this romantic, glowing, heroic portrait. The Klan never had the ritual of burning the cross. That was something that D.W. Griffith came up with because he thought that it was a great cinematic image. So it was literally an instance of life imitating art.
The ripples emanate far out from just the simple fact that it's a movie in the early motion picture age.
With the tremendous burst of popularity,
I just want to quickly point out too, in my very first video on this channel, I did a reaction to HBO's 4 Hours at the Capitol, and it's talking about January 6th. And it's about, the video itself is about white myth making, and this whole section about Birth of a Nation fits in so perfectly into that, because what people don't understand is you throw a pebble and there are reverberations forever. We are still feeling the effects of the Reagan administration, especially in the Black community. We are still feeling the effects of Birth of a Nation as a political blockbuster film that everybody saw to this day. It has informed so much of people's opinions about Black people, as well as that time frame, because the powers that be were working hard in order to construct a narrative about what a Black man is, and that was all predicated on the fact that they did need more laborers in the field. And so if we continue to hypercriminalize Black men through all forms of media, then they will be arrested more, then they will be accused of crimes more, then they'll be put in prison more, then we'll have a labor force to pick this cotton that, we can't pay people to pick. And we can get wealthy again using free labor, slave labor. It's ridiculous.
That the Ku Klux Klan had as a result of Birth of a Nation came another wave of terrorism.
Who are those white people? Are you related to any of these people in these pictures? Let me know.
Murdered by mobs on the idea that they had done something criminal.
National Democratic Convention in New York in 1924, it is estimated that at least 350 delegates were Klansmen.
The demographic geography of this country
People
was shaped by that era. We have African Americans in Los Angeles and Oakland and Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, New York, and very few people appreciate that the African Americans in those communities did not go there as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went there as refugees from terror.
We didn't just land
exactly
in Oakland, in LA, in Compton, in Harlem, in Brownsville in 2015. This is generational trauma.
The letters KKK were carved with a penknife on the chest and stomach of this man in Houston, Texas, after he had been hanged by his knees from an oak tree and flogged with a chain.
Wow.
The Chicago Negro boy.
We're going to be doing a true crime story on this.
Most attractive wife.
God, that picture haunts me.
And then when it became unacceptable to engage in that kind of open terrorism, then it shifted to something more legal. Segregation, Jim Crow.
Laws were passed that relegated African Americans to a permanent second-class status.
These things really begin to live out the prophecy that Griffith was making about the way that race operates. And this fear of crime is central to all of this.
Every time you saw a sign that said white and colored, every time you had to deal with the indignation of being told you can't go through the front door, every day you weren't allowed to vote, every day you weren't allowed to go to school, you were bearing a burden that was injurious.
Civil rights activists began to see the necessity of building not just a civil rights movement, but a human rights movement.
And I think we should start now preparing for the inevitable. And let us, when that moment comes, go into the situations that we confront with
Wow.
a great deal of dignity,
Ugly,
sanity,
ugly,
and
ugly.
reason.
Ugly people. Wow. Wow.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
We've just got a report here on this end that the students are in
to integrate the bathing beaches.
Wow.
The Florida Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission warned that the city was becoming a racial super bomb with a short fuse.
Civil rights activists began to be portrayed in the media and among many politicians as criminals, people who were deliberately violating the law, segregation laws that existed in the South.
For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied.
I think that one of the most brilliant tactics of the civil rights movement was its transformation of the notion of criminality. Because for the first time, being arrested was a noble thing. Being arrested by white people was your worst nightmare. Still is. For many African Americans. So what they did, they voluntarily defined a movement around getting arrested. They turned it on its head.
If you look at the history of black people's various struggles in this country, the connecting themes is the attempt to be understood as full, complicated human beings. We are something other than this visceral image of criminality and menace and threat to which people associate with us.
And you misuse democracy in the street.
Let us lay aside irrelevant differences.
Irrelevant differences.
Make our nation whole.
Sound familiar? Sound like what they were talking about? Sorry. That was Lyndon B. Johnson talking. And he's talking about, his speech before signing the Civil Rights Act or whatever. Irrelevant differences. That's how he described racism in this country. Irrelevant differences. That sounds and rings to me exactly how right after January 6th happened, Republicans and conservatives and people on the right were talking about how this wasn't that big of a deal and we just want to be unified again, and you guys talking about it is separating us more and all of this stuff. It's I feel like it's for some reason ingrained or something, this white myth-making chip or something, where it's just like, that's not what happened. These aren't irrelevant differences. These are people's lives. This is fundamental inequality in a system. And you're going to sit here and say, oh, we need to stop talking about irrelevant differences and come together. That person just lynched my friend. Like, how am I supposed to, come together with them? We just want to be able to vote. We just want to be able to sit at a counter without being hot coffee and cigarettes being thrown and put out on us. But this is the system for which people lack critical thinking skills in this country, lack the ability to know true history, and don't understand. We're fundamentally speaking to people who don't know or don't understand the depths of this stuff. They're not going out to look, obviously, but they don't understand how far it goes and how people were socialized and are continued to be socialized to belittle the racialized issues of this country that are basically its downfall. So,
at the very same time that the civil rights movement was gaining steam, crime rates were beginning to rise in this country.
Crime was increasing, and the baby boom generation that had emerged immediately after World War II, now they were adults. So just through sheer demographic change, we had an increase in the amount of crime.
And became very easy for politicians then to say that the civil rights movement itself was contributing to rising crime rates, and that if we were to give the Negroes their freedom, then we would be repaid as a nation with crime.
Wow.
The prison population in the United States was largely flat throughout most of the 20th century. It didn't go up a lot, it didn't come down a lot. But that changed in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we began an era which has been defined by this term, mass incarceration.
This is a nation of laws, and as Abraham Lincoln has no one is above the law, no one is above.
It's funny that Nixon is saying this, knowing what happens to him. Oh my God.
Are set that shape decades or centuries. This can be such a moment.
It's with the Nixon era and the law and order.
Love her.
Begins to stand in for
She worked at my college. Queen.
The word war is appropriate. It is in the fight against crime.
Part of what he talked about was a war on crime, but that was one of those code words, what we might call dog whistle politics now, which really was referring to the black political movements of the day, Black Power, Black Panthers, the anti-war movement for women's liberation and liberation at that time, which Nixon felt compelled to fight back against.
Once the federal government, through the FBI, moves into an area, this should be warning to those who engage in these acts that they eventually are going to be apprehended.
There's this outcry for law and order. And Nixon becomes a person who articulates that perfectly.
There can be no progress in America without respect for law.
Many people felt like we were losing control.
We need total war in the United States against the evils that we see in our cities.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
A war on drugs, and that utterance gave birth to this era where we decided to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue rather than a health issue. Hundreds of thousands of people were being sent to jails and prisons for simple possession of marijuana, for low-level offenses.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive.
This call for law and order becomes integral to something that comes to be known as the Southern strategy.
Listen up.
Begins to recruit Southern whites, formerly staunch Democrats, into the Republican fold.
Persuading poor and working class whites to join the Republican Party in droves.
By speaking to, in subtle and non-racist terms,
Thinly veiled racial appeals.
talking about crime, by talking about law and order, or the chaos of our urban cities unleashed by the civil rights movement.
We have launched an all-out offensive.
You see, the PR this country has is insane.
Tough and law and order was part and parcel of the backlash of the civil rights movement.
Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs is all about throwing black people in jail. He said, quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
I'm speechless. I'm speechless.
Change forever. They declared the war on drugs like a war on terror. But what it really did was let the police terrorize whoever. But mostly black boys, but they would call us niggas and lay us on our belly while they fingers on their triggers.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office.
The election of Ronald Reagan was in many ways transformative in a negative sense.
President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but President Ronald Reagan turned that rhetorical war into a literal one.
It's back to school time for America's children, And while drug and alcohol abuse cuts across
Nancy
all
looks
generations,
insane.
it's especially
She looks like a
damaging
wax
to the young
mannequin.
people on whom our future depends.
The modern war on drugs was declared by Ronald Reagan in 1982.
As we mobilize for this national crusade, I'm mindful that drugs are a constant temptation for millions.
Popular opinion polls of the day show that it wasn't an issue for most people in the United States. But Reagan was determined to put this onto the agenda, to define it. There was a crisis in the U.S. economy at that time.
I regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression.
There is a frontal assault on institutions that are designed to assist human beings on the education system, welfare, on jobs, health care.
Government programs that can't be paid for out of a balanced budget must be paid for out of your pocket.
They're saying the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
The idea of expanding the freedom of American business and the entrepreneurial class.
We will save $1.8 billion in fiscal year 1982.
Luxury stores like Neiman Marcus predicts record sales.
The number of Americans dipping under the poverty level has reached the highest rate in 2 decades.
Yes, there has been an increase in...
I just want to say this. Typically, and you can search this up and fact check me if you want to. Typically, Republicans in office, meaning the presidential office, leave the country in a recession, and Democratic presidents move us out of that recession. That is a trend that has been seen, that people have been keeping track of. So I just want to say that. Trickle down tax economics does not work. It has never worked. It is a lie. It is a philosophy that literally has never helped any person that was actually in need. It just protects wealthy people. And I think that's why there's always a recession when a Republican president leaves office. So take that with what you will.
Crack was largely an inner city issue and cocaine was largely a suburban issue.
Smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an uncontrolled fire.
Congress, in virtually record time, established mandatory sentencing penalties for crack that were far harsher than those for powder cocaine.
The same amount of time in prison for 1 ounce of crack cocaine that you get for 100 ounces of powder cocaine.
Police here are cracking down.
Did you hear that? 1 ounce of crack was treated the same as 100 ounces of powder cocaine when they're virtually the same drug, just, you use them differently. Does that make sense to you? See, this is why I started this channel. This is what true crime means to me. This is true crime to me. The legislative branch, the judicial branch, all of these people came together to make these laws about crack that they knew would largely affect inner city people, meaning they would largely affect poor, working class people of color. Point blank period. Point blank period. So I started this channel to talk and expand what true crime is as a genre, because this is true crime. This is violent. This is violence. This whole, what we just watched is violent crimes. And now, of course, because they made the wrong choice and it was a law and they, it was all legal and above board and all of this stuff, they can sit here on this documentary and say it wasn't a good choice. That wasn't a smart choice in hindsight. And it's like, how many people's lives have you completely ruined and derailed? And we're still dealing with that shit today. Absolutely. So it's just frustrating because that should be illegal. Like that shouldn't be okay to do to whole communities of color. And they did it happily and played into the fear of it all in order to affect greatly inner city black communities and brown communities. So, this is what true crime is to me.
A scythe went through our black communities, literally cutting off men from their families, literally huge chunks just disappearing into our prisons, and for really long times.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
You know, these sorts of disparities under Reagan quickly exploded into the era of mass incarceration.
What Reagan ultimately does is takes the problem of economic inequality, of hypersegregation in America's cities, and the problem of drug abuse, and criminalizes all of that in the form of the war on drugs.
We absolutely should have treated crack and cocaine as exactly the same thing. I think it was an
Shoulda, coulda, woulda.
a burden on the black community, but it also fundamentally violated a sense of core fairness.
When crack cocaine.
I just want to quickly review here, okay? We just went through post-Civil War, post-freedom of slaves and stuff, 13th Amendment. We were talking about how there was a message to basically hyper-criminalize black men, particularly to be kind of the face of what a criminal looks like. And this is all working during that time and continuing till now, right? As a societal indoctrination. When you see a black man, you should feel threatened. That is what they're essentially telling you through their media marketing. From the beginning of the 13th Amendment, for the goal of taking those men that are rounded up and hyper-criminalized to prison to work for free and provide free labor, or close to free now, on goods and labor and stuff like that. That was the goal then. Now we're adding on this layer of the war on drugs, right? So we have already this sense, and by this time people are indoctrinated. They know what a criminal looks like. It's usually a black man, and they represent that through the media over and over again, but they've been told this since they were young. Now they're cops. Now they're policing black and brown communities, over policing them, because these are where the criminals are. This is what the criminals look like during a time when there was relatively no difference in terms of how many black people did drugs and how many white people did drugs. In fact, white people did more drugs just based on majority alone, right? But because of this conditioning and indoctrination of what a criminal is in America, criminal equals black male figure, right? Now, these people have the inkling to go into inner city communities, hyper-police, hyper-criminalize black men and brown men, catching them up with drugs, which was, obviously somewhat common at the time, but also a way for people to make money, because we were literally in a crazy recession at the time and there was no social services to help people to make money. So oftentimes people move towards illegal activity to fund what they need to fund, right? And then you're telling me on top of that, they're already pointed out who a criminal is in this country. They go to they're over policing where these types of people live. Then they create a law that says that 1 ounce of crack cocaine, which is more likely to be held in the hand of a black male, is worth the same sentencing as 100 ounces of powder cocaine. Do you see how it just builds and builds and builds? But it's all working for the same purpose. That's why there's that saying, slavery by another name. It's all working for the same goal and the same purpose. And it's ridiculous.
And you see a rhetorical war that was, announced as part of a political strategy by Richard Nixon, and which morphed into a literal war by Ronald Reagan, turning to something that began to feel nearly genocidal in many poor communities of color.
So Nixon's Southern strategy was implemented right after the Civil Rights Movement. He played on fear of crime and law and order to win the election easily. Reagan promised tax cuts to the rich and to throw all the crack users in jail, both of which devastated communities of color, but were effective in getting the Southern vote.
You see?
No understanding of our American political culture without race at the center of it.
Okay.
And in 1981, just before Reagan assumed the presidency, his campaign strategist Lee Atwater was caught on tape explaining the Southern strategy.
Oh.
In other words, you start out, and now y'all want to quote me. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you get it so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
This is America.
Local news at night, you see black men being paraded across the screen in handcuffs.
What did we talk about?
Black men and black people in general are overrepresented in news as criminals. When I say over...
What did we talk about? This is following the legacy of Birth of a Nation. This is following the legacy of post-slavery, post-13th Amendment America, trying to find criminals in order to be laborers that don't get paid. And we're still seeing this. This is 1985, I think they said, that they're talking about, through the show Cops, through propaganda, through overrepresentation of black people as criminals on TV.
Represented, that means they are shown as criminals more times than is accurate that they are actually criminals, right? Based on FBI statistics.
Okay, did you hear that?
I'm a big believer in the power of media full of these cliches that basically present mostly black and brown folks who seem like animals in cages, and then someone can turn off the TV thinking it's a good thing for prisons because otherwise those crazy people would be walking on my block.
Creating a context where people are afraid, and when you make people afraid, you can always justify putting people in a garbage can.
Chances are you could run into a kid waiting to relieve you of your purse or wallet.
Every media outlet in the country thinks I'm less than human. I began to hear the word super predator as if that was my name.
Super predator, predator, super predator.
Super predators, end quote. That's the word they use to describe this generation, and it was very, very effective.
Experts call them super predators.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience,
Hillary.
no empathy.
Group of kids who are growing up essentially fatherless, godless, and jobless.
For me, what's more disturbing is the degree to which black people bought into that.
Okay.
Beasts that needed to be controlled.
When those grandmothers say, but he's a good boy. He never did anything. Don't you believe it?
Many black communities began to actually support policies that criminalize their own children.
Under 18 all went to adult prisons for 6 to 11 years before DNA evidence proved they were all innocent.
We make them their crime. That's how we.
And that's one of a million stories.
That's a sex offender. That's
Right.
a burglar. That's
Right.
a gang leader. And through that lens, it becomes so much easier to accept that they're guilty and that they should go to prison.
The objective.
I just want to quickly say this. This is why I knew from jump that Donald Trump wasn't for me. And that's why a lot of black women voted in the 90 percentile and above against him because what did he come out the gate saying when he started campaigning the first time? Mexican people coming across the border were rapists, criminals. Sound familiar? That thing, those ways of describing human beings, right, in general, in mass, is a tactic used by the ruling, power to describe people and dehumanize them slowly. Some people said it was a joke. Some people said it was alternative facts. Some people said it wasn't a big deal and were being dramatic. The point being, little things pave the way and prime the way for big situations to happen. Him starting off with saying that these human beings that were seeking asylum at the border, not all of them, but a lot of them, trying to come to America to get a better life, were rapists and criminals only. paved the way for policy to be put behind that when he was president, that basically said that completely detach kids from their families and put them in cages. Do you see how there's a linear line here? So that's why when we talk about terminology, it's not us being overly critical or semantical or obsessed with details and trying to split hairs. It's because the more and more you produce content that says that people or individuals are creatures, predators, criminals, rapists, all of these things, robbers, anything negative associated to them that dehumanizes them fundamentally, primes the way for policy to then be inputted to carry out that same act. You see, they started with the hypercriminalization back after, the 13th Amendment, post-Civil War. And now we're seeing the policies that trickled down after that continued to underscore that people felt that Black people didn't deserve to live a full, free life. These policies put Black men in jail. So many communities were completely decimated by these policies. And you heard the recordings, you heard that guy that was quoted saying it. They knew what they were doing. They knew that they were creating a false phantom for the masses of middle America to be scared and southern white people to be scared of. They knew they were creating hysteria, but what was the goal? The goal was to hurt Black people more than white people were hurt. He said it. He said it. So let's not play dumb. Let's not play coy. Let's not be purposefully obtuse about the realities of this country. They said it. They said it. They said it was constructed. So let's not start with that because it was constructed. All right?
We had consistently had squishy, soft liberal won't protect you, tough conservative will protect you. And we won that fight every time. And by the late 80s, early 90s, people like Bill Clinton began to figure out they had to be able to match us.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Bill Clinton is trying to figure out how he can deal with a country that's still basically Reagan's country, but he's trying to govern as a Democrat.
Violent crime and the fear it provokes are crippling our society.
Then some high-profile, very horrendous crimes take place.
Residents pulled together in the search for 12-year-old Polly Klaas. They're now coping with the discovery of her body over the weekend.
Polly Klaas abducted from her bedroom at home and ultimately killed, which led to the California 3 strikes and you're outlaw.
When you commit a third violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
A person is convicted of their third felony. Essentially, that person is mandated to prison for the rest of their lives.
So many third strike defendants awaiting trial, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department is forced to release 4,200 misdemeanor inmates every month to make room for incoming 3-strike prisoners.
And it's in line with many of the other policies we've created, particularly mandatory minimums.
Mandatory sentencing. We said we were no longer going to let judges consider the circumstances around a crime. We're just going to impose a mandatory sentence.
And that's a difficult thing for judges because they are trying to dispense justice on a daily basis and are unable to do so.
In many California communities, all civil trials have been canceled to catch up with the criminal case workload.
We've taken discretion away from judges, arguably the most neutral party in the court, and given it over to prosecutors.
95% of the elected prosecutors throughout the United States are white.
Serious, violent
Of
criminals
course.
serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We passed a truth in sentencing law that kept people in prison for 85% of their sentence.
Truth in sentencing. The idea is you're sentenced to a certain amount of time. The public wants to be confident that you're going to do just about every bit of that time.
We've done away with parole. So when you get, in the federal system, when you get 20 years or 30 years, that's what you got.
We had parole in this country as a mechanism for getting people out of jails and prisons when it was clear that they were no longer a threat to public safety.
We are a nation that professes freedom, yet we have this mass incarceration, this hyper incarceration that is trawling into it, grinding into it. our most vulnerable citizenry, and is overwhelmingly biased towards people of color.
Child. I mean,
But I want to say a few words about it.
oh my gosh, they're breaking it off in this documentary. Now he feels bad.
Made the problem worse. And I want to admit it.
His 1994 crime bill, something that he now admits was a mistake.
Longer sentences. And most of these people are in prison under state law, but the federal law set a trend. And that was overdone. We were wrong about that.
Well, I think it's important that President Clinton acknowledges that things didn't turn out exactly as he and all of us would have wished.
I'm happy that he realizes the error of his ways. I think he knew back then that it wasn't good policy, I'll be honest.
Back then, there was an outcry over the rising crime rate. And people from all communities were asking that action be taken. Now, my husband said at the NAACP last summer that it solved some problems, but it created other problems, and I agree.
I'm glad to see that he is apologetic, but I think he has to take responsibility and accountability for that, and so does Hillary, because she supported it then and up until recently.
We shouldn't ask, why is Bill Clinton so strong? We should ask, why is the black community so weak in our inability to defend ourselves?
Oh, talk about it. Talk about it.
Martyrs we put in the ground in the 60s and 70s. Let's not forget how many of our leaders had to leave the country or are in prison. You've stripped out a whole generation of leadership. You ran them out the country, you put them in prison, you put them in cemeteries. And then you unleash this blitzkrieg. And we don't have the ability to defend ourselves. You can tell the story of white leadership in America and never mention the FBI one time. You can't tell the story of black leadership, not one, without having to deal with the full weight of the criminal justice system weaponized against black dissent.
Okay.
Under the threat of death, I have no martyr complex. I want to live as long as anybody in this building tonight.
Dr. King, people forget, was not this beloved figure that everybody wants to put on a pedestal. He was considered one of the most dangerous people in America by the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Don't tell me that Dr. King has no relevance to the young brothers in the street. They deal with little bitty cops. He was dealing with the top cop.
We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about.
Malcolm's whole entourage was infiltrated with police. He had as many police in his entourage as he had regular folk in his entourage.
Okay.
So afraid of black dissent.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover today asserted that the Black Panthers represent the greatest internal threat to the nation.
J. Edgar Hoover said, these Panthers represent the greatest threat to American democracy at the time. The Panthers never were that big. I mean, no one in their right mind could ever believe that the Black Panthers were going to bring down the greatest military force in the history of the world. The whole movement was criminalized and destroyed systematically by the government.
I think people haven't thought about what it means to lose a Fred Hampton. Who somehow was able to pull together blacks,
Black Messiah,
and Puerto Ricans and Native Americans to fight for justice at 21.
We're going to say justice, not the I'm locked up, not the everybody's locked up. That you can jail revolutionary, but you can't
jail revolution.
He had to go.
The head of the
Right.
Panthers in Illinois was killed today by police in Chicago.
Illinois Panther Chairman Fred Hampton and another Panther leader from Peoria, Illinois, were killed.
This is where our chairman had his brains blown out, and he lay in his bed, sleeping at 4:30 in the morning.
They literally went and shot his whole house up with his pregnant wife next to him in the bed. So afraid of a leader that could unite them. Assad Shakur was one of the great leaders of the Black Liberation Army.
That order given by J. Edgar Hoover was essentially to destroy
any black progressive
This woman is beautiful.
movement in this country.
They put her in
Yes.
prison, and her allies said, we're not going to leave her in prison. She had white allies that said, we're not going to leave her in prison, and pulled her out of prison and got her to Cuba.
And of course, in my own case,
Yes, honey. Speak about it.
By the FBI as being armed and dangerous.
The FBI has put black militant Angela Davis on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives.
With Angela Davis, the power of the black intellect.
One of the things that we really have to talk about coming to grips with is the whole question of crime. What does it mean to be a criminal in this society?
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. Richard Nixon was the president of the U.S. The whole apparatus of the state was set up against me. And they really meant to send me to the death chamber in order to make a point.
The actions of the FBI in apprehending Angela Davis, a rather remarkable story again.
The system tried to put the sister on trial, and the sister said, no, we putting you on trial.
Period, bitch.
Comes in the big afro. She didn't go press her hair. She was facing major time. You know, most people, they'd got a nice little press. You know what I mean? They'd have been there with little white gloves on praying to Jesus. She came in like this.
Period.
And she devastated the prosecution and walked out of there free.
But the question is, Mona, how did you get there? You get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, was that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
I love this clip.
Alabama. After the 4 young girls one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class, and they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment someone we might expect to be attacked. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
And when you strip out generational leadership, walk out the country killing folk, framing folk, you will be vulnerable to Bill Clinton or anybody else. And they'll do to you what they will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
An armed neighborhood watch leader saw Martin walking inside a gated subdivision near Orlando. He thought the 17-year-old looked suspicious.
This guy deserves to die. Period.
Are you following him? Yeah, okay, we don't need you to do that.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
Alright, what is your incident number?
Tonight, a deadly shooting in Sanford. Police have the gun, they've got the shooter, but they have not arrested him.
George Zimmerman, armed with a gun, followed this quote-unquote suspicious kid after the dispatchers told him not to. They ended up on the ground in a fight, and George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. The police could not arrest Zimmerman because of this Florida law called Stand Your Ground, which says you can kill someone if you feel threatened.
I just want to sit here and say this about this disgusting blob and creature. George Zimmerman went around to white supremacist rallies and would sign Confederate flags because he became a symbol of dumb shit. He also sold the gun he shot Trayvon Martin with for over $200,000. And most recently, he tried to sue Trayvon Martin's family for $10 million because he feels like because of this case, his character and his reputation has been ruined. Electric chair. Electric chair.
Even though it was Zimmerman who had pursued Martin throughout the neighborhood with a gun.
Mr. Zimmerman felt that he, in self-defense, needed to fire his weapon.
The spotlight. How did this law not only get in place in Florida, but around the country? And all the fingers kept pointing back to Alec.
Alec sounds like the name of a high school lacrosse player who just got baked and wrecked his dad's Saab. But incredibly, it's actually even worse.
Alec is a political lobbying group.
Alec is a political lobbying group.
They write laws. And give them to Republicans.
Okay.
Stand Your Ground was written by Alec.
Alec is this private club, and its members are politicians and corporations. But the real question is, should politicians and corporations be in the same private club? Under the umbrella of Alec, corporate members get to propose laws to their political counterparts, most of whom are Republicans. So through Alec, corporations have a huge say in our lawmaking. And at Alec task force meetings, corporate lobbyists secretly vote as equals with lawmakers on bills that those lawmakers then introduce to become laws in our states.
Alec is everywhere. Roughly 1 in 4 state legislators are members.
And I am proud to stand with Alec today.
And it's not hard to see why. Alec makes their jobs troublingly easy. Here's their model electricity freedom bill, which at one point says, "Be it therefore enacted that the state of insert state repeals the renewable energy mandate." So as long as you can remember and spell the name of your state, you can introduce legislation.
We've also seen Alec bills introduced where a lawmaker forgot to take the Alec letterhead off the bill without remembering to take off the Alec letterhead to try to distance the real role of Alec and Alec corporations from those bills.
I'm just curious, does the legislation have some connection to Alec?
Representative Atkins, I'm not sure why we're pursuing this course of questioning. This bill is my bill. It's not Alec's bill.
The reason I ask is because earlier you passed out a handout that says Gottwalt at the top, and it says Healthcare Compact, and there's a logo right in the middle of that page. And I went to the Alec website, and there's exactly the same font, the same size, and the same logo. I mean, literally, it's verbatim.
Well, it's totally shocking to know that Alec has been around for more than 4 decades now. And it's even more startling to see how it began.
Alec has forged a unique partnership between state legislators and leaders from the corporate and business community.
Corporations have been influencing laws for decades now through Alec.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Nearly every...
He admitted it. Look at what we're dealing with now with the voter suppression laws. People, this isn't new. Come on.
Alec bill benefits one of its corporate funders. The corporation Walmart was a long-standing member of Alec at the time that it adopted the so-called Stand Your Ground law. It's a law that created an atmosphere where gun sales boomed. Walmart is the biggest seller of long guns in the U.S., has been the largest retailer of bullets in the world. So it's reasonable to think that Walmart benefited from these Stand Your Ground laws that Alec pushed that initially prevented the arrest of the killer of Trayvon Martin and was designed to prevent the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of the killer of Trayvon Martin, including through changing the jury instructions to require that a jury be told that someone like George Zimmerman has a right to stand his ground, but not that someone like Trayvon Martin has a right to stand his ground against someone like George Zimmerman with a gun.
People, she's breaking it off.
It was the first private prison corporation in the U.S. It started as a small company in Tennessee in 1983.
these folks started making contracts with states, and they had to protect their investment, so the states were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime. And in the late 80s and early 90s, this became a growth industry, unlike very few growth industries in America's history. It was absolutely a model guaranteed to succeed.
And one of the ways we see that is through the role of CCA within ALEC to advance a series of bills.
All the legislation you could think of that we fight so hard against, 3 strikes, you're out.
3 strikes and you are out.
Mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
Serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We're the ones that were putting out there, like on a premier prefix dinner menu, a steady influx of bodies to generate the profit that would go to the shareholders.
Right.
Through ALEC, CCA became the leader in private prisons. It's a multi-billion-dollar business today that gets rich off punishment.
Which states?
You have in this country people pleading guilty to crimes they didn't commit just because the thought of going to jail for what the mandatory minimums are is so excruciating.
Khalif Browder decided, I'm not going to take the plea.
So you had to choose between being in prison for up to 15 years and going home right then by admitting you did a crime you didn't do.
I felt like I was done wrong. I felt like something needed to be done about this. I felt like something needs to be said. If I just cop out and say that I did it, nothing's going to be done about it. I didn't do it. No justice is served.
What you're not told is that if you exercise that right to a trial and you are convicted, we will punish you more.
The courts basically punished him for having the audacity to not take a plea deal and to want to take it to trial. And in that time, in those 3 years that he was sitting there and not being charged for anything, that's when the mental health issues started to deteriorate. He started to get into fights.
After a while, I just kept hearing the same thing from the whole 3 years, and I just learned to cope with just being in there, and that was rough. I already knew. After a while, I just gave up hope.
Three years on Rikers Island, toured at a solitary confinement, and he was a child, a baby.
You miss everything about being home, the fresh air, your family, certain events. You want to be home, and then when they give you an offer to go home right then and there, it's like, I want to go home, but then you know you didn't do it, so you don't want to take the plea and say that you do it. It's not right.
Mm-hmm.
I was scared all day because I didn't know where it would come from. I don't know where any harm would come.
Khalif suffered through so many beatings, both by the people he was locked up with and the guards, he ended up attempting suicide on several occasions. After almost 3 years in jail waiting his trial, they dropped all the charges and he was set free.
Are you serious? Are you serious? Are you serious?
Environment that people have argued is designed to break you within 30 days.
I can't really tell you what's next, but this happens every day.
2 years after his release from jail, Khalif Browder hanged himself at his home in the Bronx. He was 22 years old.
We got to ask ourselves, do we feel comfortable with people taking the lead of a conversation in a moment where it feels right politically?
Historically,
okay.
Looks at efforts to create reforms, they inevitably lead to more repression.
And so if we leave it up to them, what they're going to do is they're going to tinker with the system. They're not going to do the sort of change that we need to see as a country to get us out of this mess. And they're certainly not going to go backwards and fix the mess that they've made because they're not ready to make that admission. But as a country, I don't think we've ever been ready to make the admission that we have steamrolled through entire communities and multiple generations when you think about things like slavery and Jim Crow and all the systems of oppression that have led us to where we are today.
That was a word.
Attention. But there's a kind of historical trajectory that we can trace here through media and technology. We went back to the slavery era when people were writing autobiographies or slave narratives. Later in the 19th century, people began to use photographs and they showed images there's a famous image of Slave Gordon and his back, and you can see just this kind of lattice of scar tissue that is evidence of the whippings that he received.
The difference now is somebody can hold up one of these, get what's going on, they can put it on YouTube, and the whole world has to deal with it. That's what's new. It's not the protest, it's not the brutality, it's the fact that we can force a conversation about it.
We have been consistently being murdered as a result of police aggression.
Mm-hmm.
They generally would excuse it by calling us criminals.
Mm-hmm.
When they was killing Oscar Grant. When they got to Eric Gardner.
Everyone pointed out the fact that he was saying, I can't breathe. But the sentences before that were, why are you always stopping me? Why is it day in and day out, week in and week out, you're stopping me? And that, I think, is hugely important.
When we think about the children who were killed at the hands of the state,
those images are so emotional for me and for most Black people in general, but it's just like I've seen that video so many times, and you know, like, what can you even say? What can you even say?
I think about Tamir Rice at 12 years old and the way that he was killed, you know, it hits my heart.
That's what really this Black Lives Matter moment is about. This question of whose life do we recognize as valuable?
The opposite of criminalization is humanization. That's the one thing I hope that people will understand.
It's about rehumanizing us as a people and us, right, as a people, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
The system of mass incarceration has grown and sprawled and developed appetite that is gobbling up people in communities of all colors. But if it hadn't been for the fact that it began with a group of people defined by race that we as a nation have learned not to care about, we wouldn't be talking about 2 million people behind bars today.
People say all the time, well, I don't understand how people could have tolerated slavery. How could they have made peace with that? How could people have gone to a lynching and participated in that? How did people make sense of this segregation, this white and colored only drinking? That's so crazy. If I was living at that time, I would have never tolerated anything like that. And the truth is, we are living at this time, and we are tolerating it.
Period. Fucking-ud. Sorry for getting a little emotional. You know, actually, I'm not sorry for getting emotional because it's an emotional topic. Mass incarceration is something that affects people like me disproportionately, and there have been stories since the beginning of time about this fact. Why does my grandfather have the same stories that I have in my lifetime? You know what I mean? So I got emotional because those videos, specifically of Eric Garner, trigger me to oblivion. It just takes you to such a dark place, into such a sad place, into such an emotional place, into such a defeated place. And it's tough. And this is what I mean. Like, when all the George Floyd stuff was happening in summer 2020, and you saw the outcry, you saw there was one day where every state in the country was protesting, and 18 international countries were protesting at the same time. Okay, we're done. Okay, you can't keep treating us like this. Like, we're tired and we're done completely. The fact that Eric Gardner's killers went scot-free, it's only now recently that these police officers are actually getting prosecuted to the extent of the law. But it was an emotional documentary. That's why I wanted to watch it. That's part of the reason why. It is so informative. It is so well constructed. It takes you linearly through the time periods: post-slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, the 80s, the 70s, war on drugs, the 90s, all of these things. It takes you through all of these moments in time that have been particularly brutal to people that look like me, right? And it truly does such a wonderful job about creating context, which I think is so important, which is part of the reason why I wanted to rewatch it. I haven't seen it in a long time, but that's part of the reason why I wanted to rewatch it on this channel, because it does such a wonderful job of providing context for which these situations were allowed to happen and allowed to take place. It adds historical context so that we can see that there is a historical trend that we are setting. There is a value system in this country about people's lives, and the fact that the people that have been subjugated the most historically are affected by these legislations and laws and ways to do things. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. The other reason why I wanted to watch this documentary, kind of related to the contextual aspect of it, is the fact that ultimately it creates and makes visible and makes real the social contracts, the sociological effects that these legislations, these laws, these people have put into place, and how these things affect real people. However abstract they get, the intention was to hurt a population of people, and it has. And there is historical legacy that proves this fact. I'm not just making it up for fun. So, suffice it to say, I just want to end on this. The fact of the matter is, this is true crime to me. This is what true crime is. That is criminal, the way these people have been acting towards us for years with impunity. This is what true crime means to me. It's a legacy. It's a generational trauma that still has to be answered for. Because suffice it to say, and I'm not trying to get hype up in here, I'm not trying to, but some debts are blood debts. And a lot of those blood debts, it's coming time to pay up. Because you can't reform this. You can't make this better. You can't make this acceptable. Because it's just criminal. These people are the thugs. These people are the gangsters. These people are everything that they've been trying to project on our communities for years. And they've been able to do this because they have a position of power. All we want is to be treated equal. That's all we've ever wanted since Plymouth Rock landed on us. That's all we've ever wanted. And we are still fighting the same fight. And it's tiring. True crime, to me, is this. It's the complete negligence, ignoring aggressiveness towards communities that have done nothing but tried to survive. And the way that this system has been made up, there's a lot of true crime stories that we don't talk about because it would put the system on trial. And, I think I'll just leave it there. Again, your girl got emotional, but hey, it's good to cry. It's good to let it out. And I'm glad if you got emotional too, comment down below. Let me know what you thought about the documentary, please. And with that said, Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards. Love you guys.